Mind Your Own Business Radio.
Good Saturday morning. I'm Debi Davis, and this is Mind Your Own Business Radio on News Talk WLOB. We're talking small business, we're talking personal business, and this hour we're talking wind business with Brad Blake of the Citizens Task Force on Wind. Brad Blake, welcome to Mind Your Own Business.
I'm pleased to be here.
I was chatting with you after the show you did with Derek Volk, and we were talking about wind, and I wanted to further that conversation. Now, when we talk about wind in Maine, I recall them pitching it as though it was going to take us off oil. Is that possible?
That is one of the most commonly held and perpetuating, I might add, myths for pushing wind power. Here in the United States, less than 1% of all of electricity production comes from oil. Here in the state of Maine, it's virtually none. The one place that we do use oil is actually quite unfortunate, and that is the old oil-fired Lyman plant on Cousins Island.
Right.
It sits there idling, staying warm, as it's called in the business, so that if we need it for peak power production, it can fire up and provide a lot of megawatts, actually. It's over 600 megawatts of power that is actually available if that is cranking all the time. The unfortunate part of that, however, is that when it is operating, it is the largest single source of air pollution that's generated from within the state of Maine. And the connection there with wind is that one of the problems with wind is it's not dispatchable. It's entirely dependent on the speed of wind when it happens to be blowing. And there's an sort of an inverse relationship between the demand for electricity, which is lowest during the wintertime when it is windiest here in the state of Maine, and electricity demand in New England being the highest during the summertime months when the wind production is the least. An excellent example of that is this past year. The week ending July the 14th, Saturday, July the 14th, is the peak demand for ISO New England for electricity. The grid provider is ISO New England. And if you look at their figures for the week, starting out on that Sunday, every day it got hotter in New England, such that by Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, we were in a genuine heat wave. All 3 days over 90 degrees, even here in Maine, where it tends to be a little bit cooler than Connecticut and Massachusetts.
Right.
And so the demand curve goes up as the week progresses, so that on Friday the 13th, ironically, if you believe anything about Friday the 13th, that was the highest demand of any day for the entire year of 2012 in New England. If you look at the sources of electricity for that week, wind has a small amount of production Sunday, Monday, and then it goes straight downhill. So that by the time that they needed the most electricity, when they needed peak power production, the wind was non-existent. And what did they do then? They called upon Cousins Island to fire up and put all that pollution out.
Oh, boy.
So when people talk about a connection between oil and wind, I like to bring that one forward because Cousins Island, oil-fired, produces a ton of megawatts, far more dependable, far more dispatchable than wind power ever is. I happened to be on vacation at Silver Lake and Lee that week. And the Rollins project circles the western end of that lake. And from different points, you can see as many as 24 of the 40 wind turbines from the Rollins project that sprawls across Lincoln, Lee, Wynn, and Burlington, 4 communities, 7 miles of ridges with turbines on them. And so I couldn't help but observe every single day, the 6 days I was up there, that there were no electrons being produced by the Rollins project. $180 million project sitting there idle when we needed it most, and we ended up depending on oil-fired peak power.
Right. There are also many days when there's lots of wind, and people have seen these windmills with their brakes on.
Well, there's a variety of reasons for that. First of all, if you have steady wind over 40 miles an hour or a gust up to 50 miles an hour, generally speaking, you have to put brakes on them.
Because they're going too fast?
Because they would destroy themselves.
Oh, boy.
There's a very delicate balancing to the technology, and if those blades get out of balance, they could wreck themselves very quickly. Another reason why they might not be operating on a high wind day is that they may be iced up. And icing also throws them out of balance, which, if they continue to spin, would end up wrecking them.
Okay, so when we need them the most, when it's really hot, there's no wind usually, so they are not helpful then. And when it's blowing, the wind is blowing too hard, they're not helpful then either. So there's a fine window here, it sounds like.
Correct. And depending on what the model of the turbine is, like a GE 1.5 XEL or a Vestas V90, they're constructed a little bit differently, so they start producing electricity at different wind speeds. But in essence, you could walk outside and you could feel a breeze on your face and think, oh, well, the leaves are rustling in the trees, and it's kind of breezy out, so they must be making wind power.
Right.
Well, if you're feeling that from a 5 or 6 mile an hour breeze, you might think that. But it takes somewhere between 8 and 12 miles an hour before they start producing electricity at all. And it's usually around 18 to 20 miles an hour of steady wind where they will reach peak production. And there's not a lot of hours in a year where the wind will blow that steady in that particular wind speed in order for them to optimally produce.
Sure.
And that's why the capacity factor of wind power is as low as it is, because it just doesn't produce in a steady way.
And what is the capacity?
Well, we did a study of the last 12 months of reports from the wind site operators. They're required quarterly to report their sales from different sources. That's the way they report it to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And we have an excellent financial analyst who can go into the Federal Regulatory Commission website and extrapolate the data. And what we have found is that for all the major wind power projects in the state of Maine for the last 12 months, it's 24.69% capacity factor. And capacity factor is the actual output that's measured as compared to the design capacity of the wind power projects.
They've put out only 24%. What was their projected number?
If the wind power developer is pitching a project, they will always use the standard 35% because they overhype the productivity. And
even that's not a big number.
And that's not a big number. And that is including some of the highest producing areas in the United States. Altamont Pass out in California has wind whistling through there at a much higher rate than any place here in the state of Maine. The Great Plains, if you go to the maps that the National Renewable Energy Lab puts out, they're really neat because they're color-coded.
Yeah.
And if you look at the map of the state of Maine, the highest potential wind is colored purple. And there's this huge swath down through the Great Plains from the Dakotas down to the panhandle of Texas where the optimal wind is. Mm-hmm. If you go to that same map, you can click on each individual state, and each individual state is mapped.
Right.
Go to the map of the state of Maine, and the only place that may have adequate wind to support investing in a wind power project are places like the top of Mount Katahdin.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, gee, don't let that get around. We'll have some on there.
Well, to mention Mount Katahdin is to also throw out a real warning, because First Wind and other companies have a lot of meteorological data gathering towers that are in southern Aroostook and northern Penobscot and Piscataquis counties. And if they go ahead with what they would like to do in terms of the build-out of wind power projects in the state of Maine, you would, in essence, be having wind turbines built right up to the border of Baxter State Park.
Oh, wow.
Much closer than the existing projects, which you can see on a clear day from Mount Katahdin. You can see Mars Hill, you can see Stetson 1, Stetson 2, you can see the Rollins project in Lincoln, and all of those projects have the small 389-foot tall GE 1.5 turbines.
Small.
Everything now are 459 to 500 feet tall.
Oh, my goodness.
That's from the base to the apex or the top tip of the blade.
500 feet high?
Yes.
Not in the top of the blade. Okay.
Right.
That's 5 football fields.
Yeah, that's one perspective. Another perspective I like to share to people is the tallest building in the state of Maine is Franklin Towers at 204 feet tall.
Yes.
So whenever the people who live in Portland love to advocate for wind turbines being put on the ridges of the state of Maine, I always like to point out to them that the typical wind turbine is more than twice as tall as Franklin Towers. And if you love them so much, let's put a string of those around Back Cove. Put a few of them up on Western Prom and Eastern Prom, and you still have a bunch left over from a typical project. So let's go fill up Bug Light Park and Fort Williams in order to encompass what we're taking away from the beautiful backwoods uplands of Maine.
Right. I see what you're saying. Wouldn't that area, the coastline, have enough wind for these things?
There is a lot more wind around the peninsula of Portland than there is on Rollins Mountain in Lincoln.
Yeah. So why aren't they down in Portland?
Well, Portland has a wind ordinance which bans large-scale wind turbines.
You're kidding me.
Right.
I am amazed at that.
I'm not amazed at all. It's good for someplace else, but not where the people who love to see them actually live.
Oh, boy.